Next, we're going to use the Core Data Model Editor to create an expense entity.
Navigate to the file type of XC Data Model D and select this. This is the Core Data Model Editor. You can create entities, and that's what we're going to do in this video. To add a new entity, go to the bottom of the Core Data Model Editor and select Add Entities. A new entity appears with the name of entity, and to change the name, you could either go onto the right-hand side in the Data Model Inspector with the entity selected, or you can double-click or click once and then twice and change it, and let's change it to expense. Ensure that you press Enter after you finish renaming it, else it will not propagate throughout the code. So now that we have a new entity called expense, click it and let's add attributes. You can think of entities such as a class definition or a struct definition. Essentially, this is the blueprint of what our objects are going to be. Just like the entity is the overall class, the attributes are its variables. To add a new attribute, select the entity, go to the attributes section, and go to the bottom and click the add icon for adding items. Select it, and we get entity expense attribute. This is our attribute name. In our instance, let's give it name. And then we have a type to fill in. The types are actually backed by Objective-C, meaning that some of these types are actually NS types. For example, date is not just date, it's NS date. So keep that in mind when choosing your types. For name, let's choose string. Let's repeat the same thing with amount, and this type is going to be string as well. The final attribute that we're going to add is for a date. The attribute's name is date, and the type will be date.
I have a question.
What's up?
The amount, shouldn't it be a float or a double?
We can do a float and a double. I was doing string ultimately because we were getting it from a text field, but double actually makes 100 times more sense. So with our date of type date, let's talk about that date. Dale, what type is date actually?
Well, there's a date in Swift, and then there's NS date, which preceded it, which was Objective-C.
So to keep this in mind whenever we're actually interacting with this attribute, let's change the name of this date to raw date, so we know when we're actually interacting with it that it is not a date object that we're touching, it's an NS date object.
And then when we write some code in the future, we're going to do what with this?
We're actually going to create a computed property named date of type date, not NS date, but dates, that will actually interact with this raw date for us, so we don't actually need to touch NS dates ever in our code.
And one more thing before we leave here. If I select the expense entity, I notice there is a thing that says CodeGen. What should that be set to, and what are the implications of CodeGen?
So over on the right-hand side, when you have the entity expense selected in the Data Model Inspector, we have CodeGen class definition. Ultimately, what this means is when we build this application for the first time, this class will be generated in our derived data for us automatically. Ensure that you change the CodeGen from class definition to manual none, since we'll be generating our classes for ourselves.
So in the next video, we're going to create the classes and give ourselves the ability to interact with these core data entities just like they're normal objects, right?
Exactly.